So one of the viewers asked me last week after our session to do a segment on how to improve your worst piece. I guess there's some subtext to this question. How do we improve our worst piece? There are some questions that are promoted by Jacob Aagaard. So he suggests that you ask 3 questions in any position that you're playing. I guess more so in strategic positions, because when there's a tactic you just have to calculate and find it. But in a position where you're not completely sure what's going on, you can get really familiar very easily using some questions. So one question is, what is your worst placed piece? What is your opponent's worst placed piece? So this is really good. And we're going to talk just about this one question. If you want to learn more, definitely buy Aagaard's books. He goes into these things in detail over the course of several very good books. I've only read a couple of them, and not completely. I'm working my way through them right now. So I think when people say, how do you improve your worst piece, it's probably because they've heard through the grapevine this method where people are using this catchphrase, which is very useful for remembering to just talk to your pieces. Figure out how they're doing and what they would like to be doing. But this is a hard question to ask when you are a very novice player, or even if you are just sort of unacquainted with how people think about chess. Maybe you've never read a chess book. So let's break it down first into how do we know if our pieces are in a good place or not. All right, let me just change this real quick. I didn't mean to give a typing lesson, but anyway. So let's start with just 2 kings on the board. I know this is boring. This is already a draw by insufficient material. But let's just look at the kings as pieces, not as necessarily the object of the game. Let's just think about what they are, where they are, and how they move, and try to derive some principles from this. So if we look at the 2 kings, we see that they always control 8 squares in the center, and they would control fewer places from other positions. Jake's funny as always. He said both kings are well placed for an endgame. White is slightly better. Love it. And white has the move, which is even more advantageous, right? Actually, let me just run. Actually, I can't run with these pieces because the game's technically already over. But if we put the 1 king in the corner and 1 king in the center, we see 1 king controls 8, and if a king was in the corner, it would control just 3. Not including the square it stands on. So this is already interesting. Pieces don't attack the square they stand on. This is probably contrary to intuition. People think I control a spot if I stand on that spot. Like we're playing baseball or something. If you stand on a base, you control the base. But not necessarily true. And we can also see by comparing these 2 possible positions of the kings that, just to be very clear, let's pretend this king's over there. We can see that when the king is centralized, the king controls more squares. So we could use the number of squares that are controlled as kind of a proxy for activity, at least in like the average position. In some positions, it's obvious that certain squares could become critical. We've already talked about the criticality of some squares in our strategy lesson on the Stonewall defense and things like that. So some particular squares could be really important, in which case the relative values of the pieces kind of vanish. Whatever piece can control the spot, that's helpful if that square is really important. But if we're talking generally, controlling more squares is good. It increases your chances that you could reach an important square in time because you'll have more ways to try to approach that spot. And it also means that you're more likely to control an important square. So this is kind of the basis of the idea of piece activity, which I've also talked about a lot. So hold on, how do I get this thing to unhighlight? Anyway. So we've talked about that a little bit. So this is how we can start talking about activity. I'd also like to suggest something that's really weird. This is not from any book that I've read, or I haven't had this passed on to me from some other player. I think that it's kind of valuable to look at the pieces as field phenomena. If anyone watching is familiar with physics, you can think of particles not just as an actual thing that you can hold in your hand. You can also think of it as a field, and to put it in a simple way, you can think of it as how it influences the things around it. That's basically how it manifests in the world. So we could think of each piece as kind of a field. So we could look at this king as an area of control, which is a square. And of course, when pieces reach the boundaries of the board, some of their control vanishes, so they're usually more effective towards the center, but this is not true for all pieces. To think about a piece's relationship with the center, it makes sense to consider their range. Generally, short-range pieces benefit more from being in the center, so that means kings, pawns, knights. Those are the short-range pieces. So this is already kind of interesting. We can think about how active pieces are based on where they are just on the board. I didn't even put any other pieces. And we can also kind of begin to imagine how the pieces interact with each other by looking at this exact position. We can see that if there are two kings, actually, let me do the colors a little differently. If I can remember how to do a color. Okay. So these two squares are mutually controlled. Alright, I accidentally made them go away. They're controlled by the same piece. I'm terrible at this. Okay. I don't know why I'm struggling today. I just did a bunch of wrong clicks. Okay. Not struggling anymore. Okay, so as you guys can see, two of these squares are contested squares. So you can see this is an interaction between these two kings, between their fields. And this could impact their activity or their value. Hey, Headshot Roman. By the way, thanks for the raid. I added you to my auto host list, so hopefully you'll be seeing some extra traffic from my end. Anyway, so continuing to talk about this. Hold on, this is a little weird. Okay, there we go. So anyway, there's kind of an interaction between these pieces. We can see activity in this way. It's an interaction between pieces. It's an interaction between pieces in the board. I think one of the major breakthroughs for myself when I was a beginner was when I realized the importance of squares, not just pieces. I think there's a psychological tendency to focus so much on the moving parts of the chessboard and to kind of take for granted the field that they fight on. The board is actually very important, and also the pieces, they relate to the board, like being in the corner, not so good, being in the center, often better. Let's also talk about what pieces can do in two moves. So if I just take an example for one king, and I want to move the king 2 steps, for example here, I can go straight there. I can go, let's see, I could take 3 steps to go here, 3 steps to go here. I could go 3 steps in this way. I was going to say 2, but I'm just trying to show that there's a variety of ways that the king can reach the same square, often in the same number of moves. The fastest path here is directly down the middle, as in real life, but sometimes for a longer path, you can surprisingly get to the same place in multiple moves in the same number of moves in multiple ways. So if I wanted to go all the way over here, I could go like this, and like this, and this is all the same distance. So this is kind of like the long-term influence of the king. So we're gonna move on to the other pieces, and hopefully my thesis will be clear later on. Jake has a good suggestion that the contested squares should be green because blue and yellow make green. Blue and yellow only make green in light, right? In paint they don't. And I'm already butchering the squares and colors anyway, so I'm just gonna avoid doing any kind of sensible things. So here's 2 pawns, which is also nonsense. But let's talk about their influence on the board, just on the squares, how they can travel from A to B, and try to derive some principles from this too. So this pawn on the second rank, it can actually reach a variety of places. It can go here in 2 moves. It can go here in 2 moves. It can go, if it captures things, like let's pretend there were other pieces around, it could go like this. And also, I guess, technically reach here in 2 moves. That's interesting. I didn't think of that earlier. And we can also see that it can come ahead like this in multiple moves. Let's see, can I... I'm so bad at this, but you guys can see that the pawn actually has a variety of places to go from here. But this pawn doesn't have as many. In 2 moves, it can go here, and here, and here, assuming that there are also things to capture. So we can see that this short-range piece, it has fewer liberties on the edge of the board. We can also see that the pawn is really a slow-moving piece. The king is way more flexible. right? The king, we see it can go in any direction it wants. So if there's an important square here, the king can eventually reach it. If there's an important square here, the king can eventually reach it. In fact, quite quickly compared to some pieces. But for the pawns, it's not really like that. If there's an important square here, good luck for this pawn. The only way that the black pawn is going to ever reach h1 is if it promotes to a queen, which is probably the most important thing that the pawn can do long term to increase its activity. But this is kind of a nonlinearity. The activity of the pawn, it increases sharply as it approaches the 8th rank. So if we're just talking about its general activity in the rest of the board, it's limited in this way. In the center, it has like a third more options because it can attack in 2 different directions. And if it's on the 2nd rank, it also has an additional possibility of going further. So the pawn is most active on the 2nd rank, something we can derive right away from these basic observations. But it's also really important to note that the pawn is super slow. Okay, the pawn is not able to reach certain important areas of the board, and so the way that we should interact with the pawns, it will become more obvious as we go. So let's go to the knights. Okay, so I've already placed these knights in a suggestive way. This knight controls 8 places, has 8 liberties, and this is a maximum. So the knight's control is almost a constant. It's only diminished by going near the edge of the board. Here, it's only able to go on 2 places. If it was somewhere else, it might be 3, 4, or 6 squares. But it's never going to control fully 8 if it's not within, let me see, this box. Let me get rid of some arrows for you guys. All right, maybe I'll just make it a different color arrow. Sorry, I'm bad at this box. If it's in this box, it will control 8. Within, like on or within these blue arrows. If it's outside, like if it's here, then it's going to control, I guess, 6. If it's on the edge, it will be 3 or 2. So not that much. I guess also 4. Like in the corner it's 2, here it's 3, and here it's 4. So to be even more suggestive, it will be 4 on these lines. I hope I'm not butchering this. I'm not really great at counting, just for the record. So this is all a pretty picture. And I'm kind of getting at my point fast, so please bear with me, okay? The knights have some unusual issues with jumping. For one thing, if they want to go to an adjacent square, it's quite difficult. This is in sharp contrast with the king. The king is super flexible. He's just also super slow. But the knight, it's kind of fast, but only going to certain areas of the board. This is part of why the knight is such a weird, charismatic piece. So if I want to go to an adjacent square, maybe to be precise, an orthogonal square, one of these, it would take me like 3 moves, right? I would go like, hold on, let me get rid of these arrows before I make myself dizzy. So if I wanted to go here, it would take me 3 moves, maximum. I'm sorry, not maximum. Like this is the only number of moves that it will take, unless you're going through some really inefficient route. And to go to a square that's diagonal, like this one, it would be 1, 2. To go to a square that's not adjacent, but also the opposite color, it's 1, as we can see from just like any observation of the knights, like this one. And to get to some faraway squares, sometimes it takes really a long time, sometimes it takes a really short time. This is an odd thing about knights. But there's another interesting thing, because knights jump, they're kind of, they don't interact as strongly with the other pieces. So that's why they are sometimes surprisingly fast, even though they are not able to cross the board in this way. I mean, not in the way of a long-range piece. Okay, so let's talk about bishops. Bishops control, I guess, 13 squares minimum. No, 13 squares maximum. Like, here's 13. That's 7. That's 6. Total 13. And this other bishop is controlling just 6. So that's the minimum that it can do. And in 2 moves, they can cover the whole board, but only half of it, right? So they can go anywhere in the whole place as long as it's on their color. So these are strongly interacting specifically on a certain complex of squares. Now, the Rook is really interesting because the Rook just controls 14 squares on an open board. The only time the Rook controls fewer than 14 is when there are contesting pieces that limit its field. As you can see, they control the same number of squares, even though they are in totally different kinds of places. So Rooks are generally efficient, and they're also not color limited, so they're strongly interacting with all squares on the board in like just a short number of moves. In two moves, they can go to any square on an open board. The Queen is even better because it can control 27 squares, and it has all the flexibility of the Rook. But it's also interesting to note that whatever color it's on, it has a strong bias towards that color. It's going to strongly control that color, just like a bishop. So we can think of queens kind of like bishops in that they, like if it's a dark color queen, it's going to control all the dark squares a lot more. And if it's a light colored queen, then it's going to control the light squares a lot more. The reason we don't think about this so much is probably because the queens are so dynamic. They're so they interact so much with the board. They can go anywhere they want in two moves in a variety of ways, not just two ways. That we don't really think about the static feature of a queen on one color that much. But it's actually very important. When the queens are on the same color as each other, it's kind of like you have a same color bishop situation where the bishops are competing with each other. But when the queens are on the opposite color, it's like an opposite color bishop situation where they're not competing with each other, they're not interacting, at least until they switch to a new color. So these are kind of some interesting observations, in my opinion, and it helped me to think about these a lot as a beginner, at least just to familiarize myself with the pieces, but it helped me develop a combinative vision that I think is really my strongest suit, I suppose. And Jake, I don't think I would consider it like a fast king that much. I think it's important to actually demarcate between all of them. Because in some sense, we could reduce all pieces too much to a simple state of just saying, these are all just like fast or slow versions of one other piece. So if we want to characterize them, it's good to keep them separate. And I also have a thesis about this coming up. But first, I want to make a couple observations. So to accomplish a particular task, like to attack a certain square, the king can have several ways to do it. Like let's pretend the white king wants to attack this square. It can do it in 3 different ways. This is actually a lot of flexibility. You'll see when I do this for the other pieces. Having 3 ways to do the same thing increases your likelihood of success if this is an important goal. I just picked a random square just to illustrate, but in the games that I'm going to show you later, it'll probably make sense that having multiple ways is very valuable. If we just talk about these pawns, we can see that to reach a particular square, they're very limited. The reason is that usually captures are not available. So if I wanted to go to e4 with this pawn, I have 2 ways, just direct moving. Like I could go in 1 step or I could go in 2 steps. If I could capture, I could do it like this, but this is extremely unlikely that I could take 2 pieces in a row. However, it does turn out to be relevant in some very dynamic positions where the pieces are interacting a lot. So it has technically, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 paths to reach the same square. This pawn doesn't have that same luxury. To reach a square that's 2 in front of it, it can go 1 way, 2 ways. And one of those ways is extremely unlikely. So having more liberties is generally better. So this also tells us something about the placement of the pawn. It also tells us about its maximum capability. It's never going to have more paths than this. It's just not possible. For the knight, if we want to pick a square for our knight, like let's say I want my white knight to go to a4. I could play knight c5 to a4, and I could play knight c3 to a4. These are the 2 shortest paths, and there's uniquely 2 of them. There's not going to be ever 3 or some other weird number of moves to get here, unless I'm doing something kind of redundant or taking a long path more than necessary, right? So the knight has 2 ways of reaching a place. It turns out this is also true for the bishop and the rook, which makes the differences between them really interesting. So if I want my bishop to go to a4 as well, c6 to a4, c2 to a4. Exactly 2 ways. If I want this bishop to go to any square on its diagonal, it actually has many ways, but they're all kind of silly. When I was doing this, I was thinking about making some terminology like non-recursive ways to reach a certain square. Like if I want to reach f6, I could go all the way to h8 and back, but I thought this was kind of silly. Because in a real game, we'll almost never do something like that. Thank you for the follow, Hopeful Flipper. That's also a great name. So anyway, I'm mostly considering paths that don't go back. You could always overshoot a square, but in a real game, that's just usually not that interesting. So let's talk about the rook. So the rooks, they also have two ways. 1, 2 to reach the square, 1, 2. So rooks, knights, and bishops, they all have two ways to reach a certain square. The reason that they actually have different strengths is not because of how many options they have, but how they get there. So it's about how they interact with other pieces. So I guess there are two layers to the value of a piece. One is how it interacts with the board, like how well it traverses the matrix that we have. And the second thing is how it interacts with the other pieces. If we added new pieces to the chess game, it would actually change the value of all the pieces. It's kind of an interesting thing. If you like to play around with chess variants, you could definitely add some new pieces and see how it impacts the play. And also changing the size of the board matters a lot too. For example, if you play this 4-player chess on chess.com, which has fixed rules, it's actually kind of boring in my opinion. I think it's like the board is just too big for the pawns and the knights to be really that impactful. The most important thing about the king is just that you lose the game when you lose the king in the 4-player chess. And for this reason, I think 4-player chess is way more interesting when you play with house rules with people like in real life, not online. So anyway, moving on. So the queens, they have really tons of ways to go to one place. Maybe we'll just talk about one example. Let's say that the queen wants to go to just one diagonal step like this. It can go in one move, of course. But if we want to talk about its multiple options, here's another way, and another way, and another way, and another. And then there's these recursive paths where it goes back and then forward, then back again. But it already has a ton of ways just to go one square. Imagine if it wants to go across the whole board. Like if I want to go from here to like here. There's probably like a lot more ways. Actually, I didn't think about this one in particular. This one I see 1, 2, sorry, like this. I guess because it's a little bit too far away, it's not that interesting. But if it was like going from c6, I would be able to go like this and this and this and this. You can see there can be many ways for the queen. Many more ways than a knight, bishop, or rook. So the queen has just tons of options, and that's part of what gives it its intrinsic strength. No matter what size of chessboard, no matter what pieces are playing in the chess game, the queen is always going to be super strong just because it has so much flexibility to reach a particular square. It's very hard to stop a queen if it wants to reach some spot. This is also why the queen is awesome in 3 checks. We can usually sacrifice a queen for 2 checks and then finish them off with minor pieces or a rook, just because the queen is super impossible to dissuade from reaching the king. So, food for thought, part of the maybe theoretical underpinnings of the other games, the chess variants, that is. So let's talk about the interaction of the fields. I'm talking about chess pieces as if they were fields, like in physics. And I've kind of split up this example into 3 small examples. You can see that because the pawns are not very interactive, that they are divided into 3 unique sectors. The pawns on this side of the board are not going to interact with these pawns, not without more pieces being on the board. These pawns, not going to interact with these pawns or these pawns. It's just not going to happen. So the interesting thing about this position is it highlights some evolution of the field. If we have just pawns, if we can only play this, which is called a pawn game when you're training beginners. So on this side of the board, white has a very complicated and interesting thing to do. So let's come to that last. This is probably the most simple situation. Because the pawns have very few liberties, it's easy for them to become fixed. They become essentially stationary fields. This pawn is attacking these 2. This pawn is attacking these 2, and that's it. And they're neutralizing each other until some capture is made, or until one of them is destroyed. So, fixed feature of the position. Whenever something is fixed on the chessboard, that's really interesting because it allows you to devise a long-term strategy. Normally, devising long-term strategies in chess is very difficult That's why we focus in on the pawn structure. It's something that is enduring in the chess game. It's something that doesn't really go away, something we can depend on. So if we want to launch an attack, it's good to launch it from a square which will be long-term under our control. Like in this example, it might be d5 or f5, depending on what the other pieces are doing. I'd also like to highlight how these pawns which have not yet interacted on the king side are kind of destined to meet. They have no choice. They are eventually going to get blocked, or else they have to sit and not move. So it can be very strategic to try to arrive at the blocked position in the most favorable way. For instance, if you want to control g7, you would have to somehow guarantee that this pawn doesn't move. This pawn interferes with this pawn's ability to go on g7. If we want to, control a square like g6, same thing. But since this pawn is so far away, if we want to control g5, that's fully within our power. We can do that right away. Same thing for g4 and g3. We can control them whenever we want because we don't have any contest right now. So pawns are great for controlling some particular squares that are close by them. It's almost impossible to stop them from attacking those spots. And because they're such low strength pieces, because of the way that they interact with the board and the other pieces, it's actually not beneficial to exchange for them. So in that case, control of these squares can be really critical. If it's an important square, it's good to control it with a pawn. You can use it as a launching point for your attack or to prevent your opponent from using those squares. And this just derives directly from how they move and their limitations compared to other pieces. Now, over here on the queen side, we have a much more interesting and dynamic scenario. There are more pawns, so there are more ways that these pawns can interact. We have a variety of structures of pawns which could arise. Like if we advance a6, we could play either b6 or pawn takes a6 or do nothing at all, something completely different. Same thing with c6, but the critical move is b6. In this example, after b6, if the pawn takes, we can play a move like c6, threatening to take and then promote. And if they take, the next thing we will do is, sorry if I can get the colors right, advance this pawn. So I can't actually play the moves here. This was some bad foresight on my part. But I hope you guys all get the point that when there are more pieces in the same area interacting with each other, there are more combinative possibilities that could arise. And this leads to a more diverse and interesting chess game. So let's talk about how the knights interact. Here I've included some pawns, so this is becoming more realistic as we go. Earlier we were just talking about how the piece is playing on the board and maybe comparing with other positions of itself. And here we're looking at the first situation where white and black have some pieces that are competing with each other. I chose this position because it's quite typical of chess games for players of all levels. Both sides have contested the center with pawns, and now the pawns are fixed. So instead of looking at this as two pawns, I would look at this kind of as a field. This pawn is attacking these, this pawn's attacking these. Together they form a logical unit of attacked squares. Chess Engine user says, what happened to camera? I don't know what you mean by what happened to camera. Because I see myself. I think you guys should see me. Anyway. So in this situation, I look at these pawns as kind of a logical unit, and there's a weakness at the base. Now let's talk about how the knights interact with this structure. Yeah, I'm getting some reports that I'm frozen. Hopefully that will clear up. So let's talk about the white knight first. So this white knight, it's controlling 8 squares, which is generally good. But 2 of those squares are occupied by pawns. So since the pawns are slow-moving pieces, it's very unlikely that these pawns are going to get moved anytime soon. So this means that the knight basically only has 6 liberties. However, it's still important that it attacks the squares which have pawns on them, because this means that if anything takes the pawns, we can take back. However, if you want to do something dynamic with your knight, for example, if you want to travel to the square c6, or even beyond some other square, you cannot travel through your own pieces. So there's some negative interaction between your pieces and your own pieces. Let's talk about the flip side with this knight. I'm going to get rid of all these. Okay. So if we talk about this knight actually has more possibilities than its corresponding white knight. It can take the pawns, even if it's not a good idea right now, it's exerting pressure on the pawns, and it can still go to all 6 of the other places. So the dynamic possibilities of this knight on c6 are much greater. I'm just checking my stream status. Okay. So anyway, this knight that is attacking is actually more active, more strong than the other knight. This is a really important detail because the knights look superficially the same. The position has some rotational symmetry, kind of, right? So they look very much alike. But this knight is better because it attacks white pawns. It has more possibilities. This means more tactics could happen. Talking about the bishops, this situation is kind of similar because you can see that this bishop could maneuver to attack the weak pawn or maneuver in this way to attack the weak pawn. And this bishop is not able to ever capture these. It's kind of tied to defending them. So this bishop is superior to this bishop. We're going to apply these concepts to real games in just a little bit. In this situation, we see that the bishops are actually not interacting, so it's as if the other one was not even there for what it wants to do. This bishop wants to go munch these pawns. This bishop wants to do the same thing. It wants to come around and munch these pawns. And they're probably both able to succeed under certain circumstances. So this means that opposite color bishop endgames can lead to, or opposite bishop situations can either lead to a lot of liquidation in the endgame, or it could lead to mutual attacks in the middle game. These are just principles derived from how they move and what's going on in the interaction of the pieces and pawns. Okay, now with the rooks, I added 4 rooks just for the intrigue, but you can see that this rook is targeting a pawn which it can move, but it's on a square which is well protected. This whole field of protected spots from pawns, this pawn cannot advance into that field without getting taken. So that means that this rook is worse than this rook. This one's bad, this one's good. And it's the same mirror image on the other side. This rook is good, this rook is bad. In fact, this rook is worse because it doesn't even have one square in front. This rook here is better than this rook here. Okay, so talking about now knight versus bishop. In a situation like this, with minimal changes, the bishop is superior to the knight. Because this bishop can target the weak pawn, this knight is limited to defending it. This situation is really different. It's the opposite, actually. If the knight maneuvers to attack this pawn, this bishop has to babysit. In this situation, the rook is just stronger overall than the knight. However, there is a way in which the knight can pose trouble to the rook. If it's protected by a pawn, it can obstruct the rook's paths. In this example, they could just target and attack the b pawn like this, in which case the knight would be reduced to passively defending it. But in a position with a king, the king could maybe guard this pawn, and you could kind of dream about a fortress. So having more pawns on the board benefits this knight versus the rook. Now in this situation, you can see the knight is actually at least, maybe you could say it's equal to the rook. It depends on what's going on in the rest of the board. But most of the situations like this, the knight is equal. Because the knight not only stands well, where it attacks this, it supports its other pawns. And it blocks the rook's path. So this is another example where the knight is better when it's situated to attack and defend in a better way. Now, this is an example which is concrete. This is our first real chess position, where I want to highlight the difference between rook and knight. This is, I guess, an endgame study. So if you guys would like to try to solve this as a puzzle, I think I'll take a small break here to let you guys do that. It's white to play and win. And there's only one winning move. It's not trivial. Anyone want to give it a shot? Actually, if you just think about it using the concepts that I already outlined, I think this puzzle is pretty easy as rook versus knight goes. As a hint, this knight wishes it was nearby the king. Because if this knight was over here, this would be a draw. They could just, you know, keep shuffling, keep protecting, keep their king closer to the center. As long as they don't lose the knight, they're good. Alright, so Jake says rook f5. Rook f5 looks interesting, but I think in 2 moves the knight can return to the best place. Like after rook f5, I can't play knight e6 because of rook f6 check, so probably I would go knight e8. Is there even a more precise move? Perhaps. No, I think it's just knight e8. And if you try to hunt me, I'm just going to come back to the king. And this is a draw. So if knight e8 is a problem, we need to prevent knight e8. If they can play that next move, or knight e6, then definitely they're going to get into a drawn position. We have to leverage the rook's ability to control more squares than the knight. Yeah, rook e2 is correct. And at this point, they're just helpless. So let's say they play king g5. It's a desperate bid to get the king closer to the knight. What's the next move that we should play? I'd like to take this moment to highlight how the rook is attacking these and the king is attacking these. So the king is interacting with the field of the knight on this side, and the rook is interacting with the field of the knight on this side. This basically means the knight is under attack in a more general sense, even though it's not on pre right now. I think this is a very useful way to look at chess. At least it has been for myself. So what's the next thing? Right now the knight only has the a8 and the a6 squares. I'd also like to point out that the king is interacting with the potential field of this knight. Right now the knight only has 2 really good places to go. The knight in the corner is the worst of all pieces, so let's kind of neglect that one. If we're thinking about knight a6 and its potential moves from here, we can see that the king is attacking 2 of the potential moves for the knight on the second move. So the king's flexible abilities are actually restraining the knight long term. It can't step anywhere within this 8 square of the king. So how do we finish off the knight? Basically knight a6 isn't good. Knight e8 isn't good, so if we can make them choose one of them, they're probably going to just lose the knight. Yeah, it's rook e7. So now the knight is unable to go on any of these spots. It has to choose one of these 2, and then it is on the edge. And like I said at the beginning, the edge is probably the worst place for the knight. In the corner, it's 2 spots, and here we can see it controls only 4. That means I did draw my lines wrong earlier. I can't count. But 4 spots for this knight. So now the next step is just to attack it. However, they have one good place, which is b8. So what's the next move to stop them from going to b8 before we corral the knight? Yeah, it should be rook b7. Rook b7 is the best. If we played rook to e8, let me see, does this even do anything? I was going to say that after knight c7 we can repeat and then fix our mistake. But I think that after rook e8, they might even actually have a good move. I'm sure they're still lost, but maybe king f6 is relevant. because now since the knight switches color every move, these two pieces are going to be vulnerable. Like if we play king b5, the knight c7 is a fork already. So we're not really winning this knight, I guess. Not until we play rook c8. This probably finishes the job, but it's an unnecessary risk. Oh, maybe it doesn't finish the job. Interesting. So maybe anyway, I don't want to analyze this too much because it's a little boring, but rook b7 definitely finishes the job. And now all we have to do is attack that knight. And it's toast. So the fact that this endgame is winning is not surprising when you look at the rook c6. In the rook e8 line. So in this line. So actually they should choose king e7. But at any rate, you know, the rook's superior maneuvering power allows it to hunt down the knight, which is really pretty spectacular. Of course, since the knight is so strong, you know, it still has the ability to control, to take two paths to an important square, and it controls a lot of squares locally. There are positions where the knight can draw against the rook, but that's outside the scope of what I was planning for today. Okay, here's another illustrative example. So this is rook against bishop. In a position like this, white is totally helpless. The reason is that if nothing can protect this bishop, it's going to just get completely badgered by the rook. And since the bishop can't protect the pawns, the rook is long-term going to find some safe square like b4 to attack the pawns from. So the rook is generally like even more advantageous against the bishop here than normal. Contrast with this position. This is almost like a fortress position because the bishop can protect the pawn long-term, and if the rook ever takes the bishop, it could lead to a passed pawn. It activates one of white's pawns very much. However, the rook is still a rook. It will probably still beat the bishop. Especially when there's a king. You know, if the king can get superior to the enemy king, it's very likely that they will win. This position illustrates the powers of the rook against the lone bishop on an open board. Since the rook has the ability to attack squares of both colors, it has some strategic superiority when the king is not assisting the bishop. In this case, black's king is totally entombed in a mating net, so it's not helping at all. However, if they could get their king to the center of the board, there's big hope for them to draw. They basically want to run to a corner that's a different color. They would want to run their king to like h1 or a8 in order to make a draw here. Or just stay in the middle and be frustrating. So how do we win in this situation? There's a forced win for white. I think there's maybe two variations, but they basically go the same way. So let's see if you guys can solve it. I'll draw arrows for the calculation, whatever you guys think. I really like this puzzle, by the way. Some interesting geometry. Alright, so Jake is comparing rook e7, rook c7, and rook a7. Well, rook a7 drops the rook. The bishop gets to do something. Actually, I thought you would be considering chiefly d7 and b7 because they're on the opposite color. Since the bishop is only able to go on one color, it's usually just common sense wisdom to put your pieces on the opposite color of the bishop. Even if you have no concrete reason to do so, if you have a choice, you know, if you can do the same useful thing from a light square when they have a dark square bishop, that's better. But actually you have another interesting possibility, which is rook f1. which is forcing, right? Basically, in this position, if you can attack their bishop and attack the back rank, you win. Because you can get a back rank mate. So, let's say you start with rook f1. And they play a move like... Let me just pick a random move. Bishop h2. Let's pretend it's bishop h2. What would we do next? Any ideas? We need to basically keep pursuing the bishop until they line up with one of the A through E files. And then we need to skewer the bishop in the back rank. Or double attack it, whatever, pin it, who cares? All right, so rook h1. Let me see. So we do rook h1, and let's say I play like bishop g3. I'm determined not to go in the open. How do we keep chasing it? Okay, so if you do rook h3, and I play bishop f2. It looks like we're almost back where we started. Is there any difference? I think that after bishop f2, maybe it's a little redundant. So let's come back, actually. I think instead of rook h3, we can play rook g1. And the reason it's rook g1 is that after, for example, sorry, I'm going to mess up the colors again. Bishop f2, we can play rook g2, and then they can't hide anymore. For instance, if they play bishop h4, we play king h5 check, and we take the bishop on h4. So after this sequence, they're forced in the open, so this pretty much solves the puzzle. Lichess is going to restart. Wonderful. So I'll play a couple moves here. So now they have to go out in the open. And whatever square they choose, we're going to play a move like this. The most resilient is probably a move where they can control a dark square at the end, like this. But they are eventually going to run out. Like we go here and here. And there's no way they can guard c8, so they're going to just lose. A fine tactical detail. After a move like this, they can hold on for one move longer. Pad Ragnarok, welcome. I was just doing a simple lesson on, first, talking about how we know if our pieces are well placed, and then we're going to talk about how we maneuver to better places, how we improve them. In this position, we can just zugzwang them. After king h8, it's going to be classic mate. So this is a really good example of the rook's power over the bishop, generally speaking. Queen versus rook is not that interesting, so I'll just show. Like, the queen just has all the bishop's powers over the rook. So eventually, the idea with the queen is that it's eventually going to do a double attack. The queen doesn't beat a rook by itself. They're both kind of similar in strength in that particular way. So let's talk about talking to our pieces. I want to bring us to a critical moment. Right here. Okay, let me see. How should I frame this? So in this position, black's knight is hanging. So we have to basically choose a place for the knight. not just based on like where it's safe, but where we really want it to be. This pawn structure is very similar to the ones that I used in the logical examples. So let's see if we can figure out where this knight should really go with all the other pieces on the board, but also considering the pawn structure. What's the best place for it? This is also kind of subject to opinion. I like to start out with one that's more open-ended. So, whatever you think, let me know. I'm curious what Ped Ragnarok would play in this position. Alright, knight e7. Interesting. And Jake likes knight a5. Knight a5 actually has a tactical problem. If you play knight a5, because your knight's on the edge, which kind of goes with the theme of what I was saying before about where the knight generally stands best, there's b4. That's right, it gets trapped. So look out for this kind of thing. However, knight b8 also puts the knight on the edge. So does that mean that it's bad? In this case, it's not exploitable. It's on its way to another square. I find this move somewhat reasonable, although it's still not my favorite. I like knight e7. But this move is not as bad as you would think. I think there's this natural tendency for humans not to want to admit they were wrong, and making a chess move where you go out and back, it feels a lot like saying, I was wrong. I belong somewhere else. But the reality is that black provoked the pawn to go to d5, which could be construed as something beneficial. Yeah, absolutely. We don't mind going from b8 to d7 to c5. This is a long-term maneuver of the knight to a square, which is good based on the arguments I laid out earlier. If it's on c5, it attacks the weak e-pawn, and it doesn't interfere with any of the other pieces. In fact, a really good constellation would be one like this. Let me just make some moves. They're not going to be the best moves, so don't sue me. But I want to show a useful concept here. This kind of constellation is pretty good, because the knight is very snug on c5. It's attacking some weaknesses and also squares deep in white's territory. And it also perfectly is harmonized with the black pawns. It doesn't interfere with any of them, and they support it very well. So this is a desirable structure, generally speaking. Now, knight e7, I think, is the best move. And the reason is this is slightly more active because it's attacking this d-pawn. And it's also, again, not interfering with any other pawns. So after a move like c4, we could see f5, where the knight is also supporting a breakthrough. We're going to destroy the pawn structure with the support of the knight. After like knight c3, knight f6, there's a lot of pressure building. Notice how this knight is much better than this knight. This knight is attacking. It's exerting some pressure. It has more possibilities than this knight. Okay, so let's talk about another situation with knights. This is a common beginner opening, right, guys? Almost everybody has played this at least a little bit during their upcoming in chess. And I'm going to scoot ahead to a middle game position. Well, not middle game, but like late opening. I think this position is a little hard for beginning players because they have a knight on d2 blocking the bishop. So they feel kind of weird. They're like, ooh, how do I deal with this bishop not being able to move? So they end up doing really weird stuff. The key here is actually that you need to improve your worst piece. You need to find some way of improving both your knight on d2 and your bishop on c1 in a harmonious way. So let's think for a minute. Where do you guys think this knight on d2 belongs? This is also kind of open-ended, but where should it really go? Where does it lust to go to? What's the best spot? 66, welcome. Better late than never, right? You actually missed all of my boring theoretical talk about how I look at the chess pieces and their activity. So maybe you actually just arrived at the perfect time, you know? It's party schedule. All right, so Pad Ragnarok is saying knight f1 to g3. I think this is completely correct. All right, 66 said c4 and e5. I think maybe you mean f5 or maybe e3. So we have a couple different pathways that are very interesting. We want to move the rook and then play like this, and we might also want to play like this. And actually both of them have a common destination, f5. This is a very nice square because it's exerting an influence on all these different pawns. It's also not interfering with any of the white pawns. And if they take it, it also just leads to the activation of one of the white pawns. So this is a very sensible maneuver. In my opinion, all maneuvers are concrete. Some people will say something like maneuvering chess is in contrast with dynamic calculating chess. I think this is complete nonsense because maneuvers are not good for their own sake. Maneuvers are only good if they take you to a position with some concrete benefit. Having a knight on f5 is quite good. It increases your attacking prospects. 66 is saying Castro will be pleased. That's perfectly true. He put his knight on f5 in many games and just checkmated people, even at the price of a pawn. So I think this makes perfect sense. So in this line that I laid out, I start with rook e1. Now before I play knight f1, I added the move h3. The reason is, actually there's more than one reason. One reason is that we also might want to play knight h2 to g4, and we need some support. It's also good to interfere with the bishop and the knight arriving on g4, because the moment we play knight f1 is actually a somewhat vulnerable moment. Let me see, is there anything really critical here? I'm not sure if it actually is like a tactical issue. Like if we play knight g4, there's always going to be knight e3. It's not a big deal. But it's nice to kind of prevent them from doing anything active before we go ahead with our plan. And for black, they also want to use a similar maneuver. They play knight c6 to e7 to g6, and so we do the same thing. It's kind of flattery. You know, we're both just doing this maneuver, saying, hey, your plan's pretty good. I think I'll do it too. This is a made-up position, but I've been in a position just like this several times. Although I must say I'm not much of an Italian player. I often play other different things. But this is definitely the right way. I didn't just make it up completely. This position has been reached. If I just look at the light chess computer, database, it looks like this has been played at least 200 times by decent players. And Pad Ragnarok is completely correct. This maneuver maybe happens even more often in the Spanish. And the reason that we see the same maneuver in different openings is because the pawn structure is the same. The static features of the position, the long-term fields, they inform the maneuvers of the other pieces. Whatever is more static that we can rely on, that's what tells us what to do for the long term. So I'm accidentally exposing what's going on, so I hope you guys can forgive me for my sloppiness. But I want to show a game quickly, played by a strong player who's kind of local to the U.S., Shabalov. You guys might know him. He's a very good player. I've seen him play many times. And here's one game that he played recently that I thought was quite good. So he's playing black against this guy, Karamsetty. And the opening is not something to write home about. But after d5, we get the same structure that I was just talking about with you guys. There's some difference, though, because in the other position that I showed, this blocked center, the knight was not developed yet to f6. So the thing that Pad Ragnarok suggested was knight e7, and I guess his idea was to play f5. And that's exactly what I showed in that example. But here with the knight on f6, there might actually be other great ideas. So let's see what else we could do here besides knight e7. What else is nice? I'll at Jake and ask him, would you like to play knight a5? Is it a good idea here? And the reason that I'm looking at examples where the knight on c6 is hanging is because it makes it very obvious what your worst placed piece will be. Usually when a piece is under attack, it doesn't mean that's the worst placed piece. It's just that it means you need to deal with its long-term future starting right now. You're kind of pressured to make a good decision with the knight. 66 is correct. 97 and f5 is very typical on a King's Indian. And this is basically King's Indian. We are going to have to spend a move with the knight from f6 to get the f5 break, however. I still think it's good. Like, I don't know if playing h3 is necessarily going to benefit white in this situation. But also having a bishop on d3, they might be well equipped to meet the f5 break. Padragnarok is suggesting the King's Indian plan. But is there any other way that we could play this position? Yeah, we could play knight b8. So if we play knight b8, is this sensible? Jake's right. Knight a5 does have the same issue. It's b4. Yeah, so 66 and Padragnarok, they probably have different ideas, but they're agreeing it's knight b8. And this is what Shabalov played. Now, the position looks weird to a beginner. You know, the Grandmaster is taking his knight and putting it back where it started the game. Almost like just a couple moves later, right? But there is a great purpose behind it. Now that the center is blocked, the interaction of the knight's field with the pawn's field is different. So it makes sense to go back. The notion of tempo is kind of just, I would say it's a didactic tool. I wouldn't say it's something to live your whole life by. Now in this position, they play knight h2. And after knight d7, the knight actually has a comfortable, flexible future. They didn't play knight c5 right away, because after knight c5, I guess maybe they would play... I'm not sure if it would be queen e2, rook e1, or f3. They all look somewhat plausible. But the knight actually has several good options here. The main issue is that there's this e-pawn here. They would love to put a knight on e5, but the pawn's in the way. So it might be worth keeping the knight there for a short time to see if you can get it on e5. So Shabalov played a flexible move. He played king h8. And sure enough, his opponent played f4. Now, the next move that he played, I think, is a little bit tricky to understand, just based on the arguments that I'm making today. But he played c6, which is taking advantage of the knight's pressure on the center and to destroy it. They played king h1, because if they take on c6, I think it's just like a disaster. Let's say they take. I guess taking back makes the most sense. Actually, maybe not. Maybe here knight e4 is better. I actually didn't check this beforehand, but I was thinking either to play for compensation after they play queen d6, or to play like this. And they're going to lose the e-pawn. I think this is probably what Shabalov intended. But again, I didn't look at it very, very strongly. Queen b6 intermezzo. Okay, maybe this is true as well. I kind of like knight c5 though, honestly. It looks very cool. The reason this didn't like spring to my mind is that I don't know if I want my queen on c6. I think it has much greater potential than this. But this also looks really good. Knight c5's coming in. They would have to play passively, probably with like queen f3 and rook e1. In which case the pawn is interfering with the field of the rook and so on. So he played king h1. Makes sense. Hold on, let me drop a quote here. And after pawn takes, black is already better. This is a very unfavorable pawn structure. Because in order for them to defend this pawn long term, they will have to play c4. In which case, the knight on c5 will be extremely snug. Just pressuring the center squares. Actually, the reason the center is important is derived just from how the pieces navigate the center, in my opinion. Getting from one place to the other is easier if you stand in the center, for almost all pieces. So, Shabalov played knight h5, and after queen f3, pawn f4, bishop f4, I think he's just really doing super great. He played knight e5. Now, you might think, I said the knight is super good on e5, so why would he put it there when it can get taken? The reason is that whatever piece stands on e5 is going to be awesome. It's a center square, and it can never be attacked by a piece that has stability and long-term access to e5, because the pawns are gone. The pawns that can attack e5 are the most useful for controlling that spot long-term. So if e5 is a long-term stronghold for black, black is just better. For instance, after bishop takes e5, the threat of knight g3 is already overwhelming. They cannot eliminate this strong knight. So they played queen f2, and that got chopped off. The knight that was standing on the edge ended up trading itself for a bishop. And I'll show you guys quickly the rest of the game. Shabalov played, in my opinion, really well. He nailed the queen down to the b-pawn. And then he played this very active pawn sacrifice. Basically, he didn't care about this one pawn as long as it increased the scope of the rook. 66 is mentioning a lecture by Krush about what to do when two of your pieces want the same square. I don't think this is an example like that, because if we back up, the pieces are not competing. The bishop is happy to be on g7. It's exerting a long-term influence on all these weaknesses. The center squares, nothing's on them right now, but these are long-term weaknesses. So getting into the endgame, yeah, I will move this bishop, because these weaknesses will probably go away. But as long as they are there, this bishop is doing good. In fact, the power of the bishop could be expanded by a knight in front of it, because then we have new discover attack possibilities. So I don't think they're really competing. This with a knight on d7, if this knight was over here, I would say the knights are competing for e5. But even then, we could use the c5 square. Yeah, as long as we play like a5 and a4 and bolster it. But that's a fair point. When multiple pieces want to use one square, sometimes it leads to a decreased efficiency. But anyway, Shabalov played this great pawn sacrifice, and white was rendered utterly passive, and so the rest of his pieces basically just walked in. And in this position, black is a winning move. See if you guys can spot the winning move. After this, Shabalov's opponent resigned. Karamsetty had to throw in the towel. By the way, I like this example because I don't think that Shabalov necessarily had to look at really concrete stuff to win this game. I think he just puts his pieces on good squares, and the rest just naturally follows. He sets up situations where the pieces are actively interacting with the opponent's pieces, rendering them kind of passive, where they're not able to use most of their 2 or 3 move possibilities effectively. Like the queen was tied to b2, and so on. The bishop on a4 got put out of play by the a4 move. So how do we win the game in one move here? What's the secret? Knight takes b2 wins a pawn, but I think it's really selling short. Jake said rook e5. I don't know what that means, because there's no way that a rook can go on e5. This is basically a candidate moves exercise. Just look at a variety of moves. No, knight e3, I'm not sure what you're getting at. Maybe you want to win the d-pawn? Rook e8 is probably... Actually, bishop takes e8 is possible, Jake. You have to look out for these long range attacks. I think you are stumbling into them a little bit more than you should. So just look at a variety of moves here. Variety of forcing moves. You'll definitely do it. Pad Ragnarok, after knight e3... Well, 66 got it, but after knight e3, they might be able to get some counterplay somehow. Jake, multitasking, queen g1. The answer is knight b6. This just wins the bishop in one move. Maybe knight e3 is also okay, but I think knight a3 might just keep the game going. Let me see. Knight a3. Yeah, I think knight a3 might keep the game going there. But knight b6 is lights out. They have nowhere to put it. If they try a move like some counterattacking stuff, we just take on b1 and then take right here. So they resigned, losing a piece. So this was a neat example. He used this maneuver, knight c6 to b8 to d7. And it looks like a loss of time, but it's just that the knight is going to where it truly belongs, either c5 or in this case, e5. What would white play after knight e3? Maybe I'm a little delayed here, guys, so sorry about that. But after knight e3, I thought knight a3 was maybe holding. I'll just check with the engine quickly so we can move on. Knight a3 is the best move, but black is still clearly winning. I mean, they've been winning for a long time. Like, knight f5 is probably crushing here. We could also maybe take on d5. But I think knight b6 winning a piece is just simple chess perfection. It's good. Okay, so here's another example with the knights. Actually, I think you guys already got the point with the knights. So, how about this? Here's a word of caution. So, I think that people are, when they learn maneuvering type of stuff, they get really excited about maneuvering. It's like they think they've learned some secret where tactics don't work anymore and we're just going to maneuver our lives away. So, here's one game that I played recently in which I kind of fell into this attitude and made a serious error. So in this position, it's white to play. If I just make a decision based on what I'm outlining here about active pieces and thinking about their field of influence, where they really belong, it's possible to oversimplify. And in this position, I played bishop d2. My rationale, based on this approach that I'm explaining, was that my bishop on c1, yes, it is our game, this bishop on c1 has a worse future than the bishop on b4. I thought this bishop on b4 has a variety of dark squares that it could go to. And this one is kind of not so well placed because of this pawn on g3. g3 takes away one space for this bishop that I think is really critical, which has a ripple effect where the squares g5, h4, and f4 are not that great for the bishop. So I thought, hey, I'll just trade this off and enjoy some slight advantage. But little did I know that this position is hands down winning for white. So if anyone thinks they could find a winning move for white, go right ahead. I think there's more than one also. I was not concrete enough in my decision making, is how I would maybe say it. It's not that this is an exception to the rule, it's that I was not rigorous enough in my application of it. Him66 said knight f6, but you forget the line. Does that mean you checked it with a computer and you didn't actually analyze it yourself? I found a line which I think is quite within the capability of a person, no computer stuff. Alright, so d5 looks dangerous. Dangerous for whom? I think after bishop takes e1, looks a little shady, because after bishop e1 and just like queen takes e1 maybe, we could play maybe queen takes d5 or something. Yep, it's official. Jake's gone bishop blind. So, Him66 says it's knight e5. 95 probably is a winning move. It's not the one I picked. So what do you think happens after 95? You know what, Jake? Maybe it's because the bishop's highlighted that you didn't see it. It's like how I turn my brain off whenever I see an ad. I'm like, oh, this sounds important. I better stop listening. So let's say 95, for sake of argument. What would black play here? Their knight's hanging, right? So they could either maybe take the rook on e1 or rescue their knight on c6. I don't think they really have other options. If they take the knight, that looks really dangerous. Like knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1. Yeah. So knight takes d4, I guess Jake is saying. I think knight d4 is worth considering, but it also illustrates white's point. After a move like knight takes... Alright, first let's talk about this one real quick. This position is probably better for white. Looks a little unclear though. So the best move is actually knight takes f6, check, and then rook takes d1. And in this position, the rook's hanging, so this is winning for white. Okay, so I just want to clear that up before we go ahead. Now, if knight takes d4, I think this illustrates the point for white, but it's also interesting because the rook on e1 is hanging. Knight f6, pawn f6. What should it be? I'm not sure if there's a finesse here, if I should just take the rook. I was thinking that after bishop takes, the material is equal, but all black's pieces are hanging, and white's pieces are hanging too. So I was considering something to the tune of queen takes e1, pawn takes e5, and then just some kind of like awesome move like bishop e3. I don't know. Maybe this is not right. There's got to be something more forcing here, like some bishop c6 check in between. Knight c2. I don't know if knight c2 is good. Like, let's check. It's gonna be a mate here. Maybe I missed something though. But actually, I'm sure that knight e5 is winning. But the move that I thought was the most simple was bishop g5. Just say, I don't care about you taking my rook. Like, let them take. Basically, if they have any point in life, they have to take this rook. I don't see what they can do otherwise. So they take, right? And this position is just dead lost for black, mainly because the bishop on g2 is so active. It has multiple targets that are within ready reach. The field influence of white's pieces on this knight on f6 is just too great. So a sample line would be like castling. I think this is the most rational for black. And then knight e5, and it's just game over. Like, we're threatening to take this knight. We're threatening to take on f6 with some attack. For example, if they play bishop b7, we just play takes, chop, chop. Take this, say thank you. Take that, say thank you as well, and we're up a rook. Wait, no, we're not up a rook. All right, I guess I'm also off my game today. Right now we are down an exchange. Hold on, how did I mess this up? Probably have to start like this. Something like that. All right, actually, why don't we take this a little more slowly? Maybe I'm being hasty here. So I was saying if bishop b7, right? All right, thanks for dropping in, Ped Ragnarok. So what do you guys think is the best continuation for white here? Maybe taking out c6 was a blunder. Maybe we should just take right away like this. or something similar. Getting tired after a long day. Here, I'll just check quickly with the computer. It says knight f6 is winning. I was kind of expecting this kind of thing, but this is just the same thing as what we were doing. So let's just check it out quickly after knight f6. Sorry I didn't do my homework for this one. Here it's probably a checkmating attack, like queen c6 followed by queen e2. Okay, that makes sense. So we're trying queen g4. This should win the game. Alright, so that was a small detail that I lapsed on. But the main line that I checked out after this was knight takes d4, because I thought bishop b7 was just losing. Maybe I miscalculated in my initial assessment. After knight d4, knight f6, pawn f6, bishop h4. White is just totally winning. Like, the rook's hanging, and if they rescue it, we play knight g4. And the attack on the king is overwhelming. So this is an example where my decision to play bishop d2 was informed by just a comparison of the pieces and their potential based on the pawn structure, but I neglected to factor in the activity of all the other pieces. So I guess the warning here is that you can't just always be thinking in this like very small mindset where I'm looking at the minute differences between pieces. It's also important to look for the big tactical blows. So I want to show one last game, which I consider a maneuvering chess symphony, where Rubinstein is maneuvering his pieces, improving them in the most textbook way, such an instructive way, and he also wins the game from it. So let's see. I'm going to frame it as a series of exercises, but let's just first see. So he's playing against Janowski, and this game is really famous. You guys might have seen it. And we start with the 4 knights. And 4 knights is not really popular anymore, so I'll just briefly give something about why. This game happened in what year? 1907. That was a good year for Rubinstein. Now, after bishop b5, bishop b4 was popular back then, but sometime in like the 2000s, I think Kramnik pushed this knight d4 thing. 66, you are correct. It is popular in scholastics, but they also know zero theory. So at the top level, it's kind of fallen out, but beginners continue to move their knights before bishops and castle. But with knight d4, Kramnik basically like shut down the 2 knights for white. They just don't like to do it anymore. So the details of this are very complicated. I don't want to get into the full details because that's a story for another day. But I just wanted to send you guys on the right track if you want to know why people don't play 4 knights as white. So bishop b4 was popular back in this day. And a common way to play this opening at that time was to give doubled pawns. This was before the Soviet players revolutionized the understanding of dynamic chess. Which doesn't mean that this is inaccurate. This is still a fine move. It's just that the style at that time was to try to play against these weaknesses because Steinitz's influence was very recent. People were not really sacking pawns, ruining the structure for the attack the way that they did, like, starting maybe 50 years after this. So, going through the opening, this move queen e7 was probably beginning to arrive around this time. And it's a weird looking move because your queen stays in the pin. You would think that the bishop's influence on the queen is kind of staggering. And it is. But there's another reason behind this queen e7 move that has to do with his knight on c6. So what do you guys think is the purpose behind queen e7? How does it relate to that knight? What could Rubinstein be up to here? Knight d8 to e6, absolutely. That's what he's up to. Alright, I'm trying to maneuver this board a little bit. Okay. So he's trying to play knight d8 to e6. And the best way for white to meet this is probably with rook e1 and d4. and something like bishop c1. And white's probably slightly better here, just because of the bishop pair. But it's definitely unclear in my opinion. So queen d2 was played in the game. And here comes that knight maneuver. But first, bishop e6. This part's very subtle, so I guess I'll just skip over this and get to the more maneuvery moments. After bishop b3, he played bishop takes b3. I usually don't recommend this kind of thing because it activates the rook. But Rubinstein had a really specific plan for this side of the board, so you'll see. So knight e6, he finished his maneuver. And the pawn on c3 is good. It stops knight d4, but there's nothing stopping knight f4, so it's going to kind of happen at some point. Now, here he played h6. And now a6, which is bolstering this pawn against the rook. You could argue that this is a hook, however. So the pawn on a6, it's not like it's going to be safe long term, but for now it's good. It's interesting to note that he doesn't play a5, because if he plays a5, the rook has to babysit the pawn long term, and he will have to play b6 anyway to guard it. So that's why it's a6, not a5. So here I think white still should play d4. Let's see. So 66 is saying, why did black trade off his good bishop there? Is it worth it to get rid of the two bishops? Good question. So in this position, what do you think the bishop from c8 is going to do? What's its purpose? Does it have a good square? Maybe fianchetto. So if you fianchetto this bishop, you're actually dooming it to a passive existence. If you play, for instance, b6 and bishop b7, you're going to be just staring at this e-pawn. The e-pawn is very well protected. I don't think your bishop's going to do very well. Additionally, if you think about how white wants to maneuver this knight, you can see that the knight wants to go on h4 and then f5. So the knight, it's probably not good to leave it completely uncontested. That being said, in the game, he did trade it for the light square bishop. So it's all very complicated. b6, bishop d5. If they're very insistent, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I didn't think about bishop d5 at all. So I didn't really fully grasp the comment about saying it's a long-term piece. Usually the bishop is stronger long-term. That's true. But there's some concrete things going on right now. In the middle game, it's kind of like... All right, so let's say you have the bishop pair, or you have a good bishop, right? It means that some of the futures are going to lead to you having two bishops in the endgame. You want to preserve it as long as you can. But if no matter what you do, you are going to eventually lose that bishop, you have to face that reality. You can't just keep going with it. Yeah, okay, now I understand what you're saying better. So I said that if your bishop is bad in the middle game, it often doesn't matter because in the end game you're going to find a way out. But I'm not saying that it's a bad bishop. I'm saying that it's a passive bishop. If you put the bishop on b7, it's passive. Passive is not good at basically any moment. So we are going to constantly maneuver to improve our pieces. For example, let me show you this other thing, okay? Not this, this. So fast forwarding a little bit in this position, I want to just show you a situation with a bishop. Okay. I'll just skip this move. And let's pretend we're talking about black's bishop on c8. So I would tell you that this is a bad bishop because all the pawns are on the color of that bishop. Right? Basically every pawn from black. And they're fixed. They don't have any way to advance. It's also passive because it's not doing anything. So what should we do with the bishop? Just to speed things along, I think I'll just show you. The bishop wants to come out somewhere. So instead of playing like b6 and a6, which makes some sense, instead of doing that, we could maneuver it around the existing pawn structure without creating any new weaknesses. If we play a move like b6, this pawn is going to be a long-term weakness. c6 is going to be a long-term weakness. It's better not to move it. So it's going to be d7 to e8 to h5. And now the bishop is fine again. It's still a bad bishop, but now it's an active bishop. So I wouldn't really want to put it on a6 because it's not going to be that active there. It's doing something, but after a move like, I guess, b3, I don't think the weaknesses in white's camp are going to be exploitable. I mean, of course, the c-pawn needs to be protected in other ways. Probably it'll be like knight takes e4 followed by b3, something like that. But the bishop will be very passive. It's lacking targets after a move like rook f2. It's just not doing that much there. But here, it's attacking d1, e2, f3, g4. I think these are all critical squares. So coming back to our maneuvering symphony, I don't think that trading this bishop's unreasonable, but I also think this is really deep. Maybe because I'm not such a very strong maneuvering player myself. I find this very conceptually deep. But I think you can rationalize it like this. Rubinstein has a particular kind of endgame that he wants to reach. He had a very simple and long-reaching strategic vision. So even if his particular decisions seem weird in the moment, as long as they get him to the endgame that he wants, he's happy. He's done this again and again. So this is just one more example where he wrecks somebody with a 40-move plan. So it's hard to scrutinize his decision to trade the bishop like this. But it'll make sense when you see the endgame that he gets as a result of his constant trading and maneuvering. It's something you could never predict. It's just something Rubinstein was extremely good at. Now, this move a6 also has a dual purpose. It's sheltering the pawn, but it's also making room for one of black's pieces. What piece do you guys think it is? Just if you had to guess, what piece would go on a7? And I'll give another hint. What is black's worst placed piece? We have to ask ourselves. The queen, exactly. The queen is the worst placed piece. He's maneuvering into a7. So he commenced with this operation very long term. He didn't rush because he also wants to improve the knights. And it's usually common sense to improve the minor pieces before you improve the queen. So he played knight h5. He's going after the f4 square, just making the logical closure of the knight's maneuvers. After d4, they just put the knight on f4. I've also seen Carlsen make almost exactly the same formation in blitz, like not even really thinking too hard about it. He sees a bishop that's stuck like this. He puts one knight to attack the bishop, and he puts the other knight right in its face, so it has no scope. This is a really good way of neutralizing this bishop and just being a general pain to your opponent. Because if they ever play h3, you snap on g3 at that point, and the pawn structure that they get is very difficult to defend. So this is already a major strategic success. The scope and power of this bishop on g3 is essentially nullified by the knights, and the knights still have a lot of their attacking power. Their attacking scores deep in white's territory. Also, the knight on the edge is immune to g4 because the bishop on g3 is blocking the g-pawn. So there's an interference between the g-pawn's abilities and the bishop's. So he just caved and took this knight. I believe in Gelfand's analysis, he talks about queen e3 with the idea of playing rook a d1, rook d2, and rook e d1 for a much more active future. And Gelfand's extremely good in this style of chess as well. I think he probably read a book of Rubinstein's games and in his childhood many times. He was strongly influenced by the guy. So I'd consider him an authority on this style of play as well if you want to look for more model players for this style of play. So after g3, knight g6, this knight looks dominated, right? It doesn't have a bright future anymore because of the g-pawn. And this is true. But because the light square bishop is gone, you know, the one that got traded on b3, there's no way to repair this weakness. They're not going to deal with it long term. So after queen d3, queen e6, it's not that clear what black is doing with the queen. You know, he's kind of probing for weaknesses. I think he wants white to make more pawn moves. And so he also plays f5 to activate his rook. And in response, they play d5, which is basically that same structure that I've showed several times already today. And so after rook takes f5, knight e4, rook af8, his rooks are at maximum power. Notice how it would have been super weird to play queen c8 to b8 to a7 with a rook on a8. It would mean that he didn't improve his pieces in a basic way before commencing with this very long maneuver with the queen. So he did all the common sense things first. Didn't lose sight of common sense, even though he's been intending to play this queen a7 thing all along. Now, the next thing is that before he does this queen maneuver, he also has to improve another badly placed piece. Which piece do you guys think is worst placed for black right now? Queen's still doing okay. It has the possibility to go to somewhere else. Yeah, so it's the knight. So how should black improve this knight? It's dominated by the g-pawn. It's hanging. What's the best way to utilize it? Where does it belong on the whole board? Okay, so you want to put the knight on f5. But why? Why is it going on f5? I think the pawn on c3 is nicely preventing the knight from reaching its best square from f5, which is d4. And it's pressuring the pawn on g3, but not strongly to the point that I think it is very good. Here's another question. What is white's best placed piece? Do they have any great pieces? Like, why can't we play some active moves on the f-file? What's the matter? No, I mean, what is white's better placed piece? In this example, the rook on f5, it's a little bit impotent because you would like to play rook f2, but the knight's stopping it. So this means the knight on e4 is probably white's best placed piece. So how can we improve our knight and also neutralize their best knight, their best piece? What would that maneuver look like? I guess if you can tell me its final destination, you'll know the path as well. Okay, so the suggestion knight h8 to f7 to g5 has the aim of trading the knights. That makes a lot of sense. The problem is you also get a worse structure in the process. Probably they're going to be able to drive your rook away before they take on g5. So Rubinstein played knight e7, rook d1, king h8, with the idea of knight g8 to f6. No risk, not preventable. Also, if he wanted to put the knight on g5, they could play h4. You could argue that h4 is a weakening move, but it also stops your plan. So this is kind of a surefire way of getting exactly what he wants. So he made all those good trades. And then he went ahead with the maneuver of the queen. So he improves his pieces in a logical order, one by one. Doesn't make any changes in the pawn structure. He's basically following a recipe. He's practically a chef. And now that the queen is on c5, we can see that black is just better. It's a heavy piece endgame, so it's tricky to actually play. But if we just compare them piecewise, these rooks are way better than these two rooks. this pawn on e5, it's never going to be weak. If they play f4 ever to try to loosen up the strong point, they're just going to be opening their own king. So to finish off our segment, I want to just show the rest of the game. So they played queen e4, and the difference in activity of black's queen and white's queen is really distinct, in my opinion. And so he kind of just starts creeping in. This is typical Rubinstein stuff. Slow maneuvering, steadily aiming for that best endgame that you could ever have. And here, even though his queen was better than white's queen, there's no way that he could avoid this exchange, so he does it in a very favorable way. He has doubled pawns, but now the pawn on b4 is much more active than the white pawns. The pawn on b4 freezes the pawns on b3 and c2. So black is virtually up a pawn here. And if they want to liquidate, they're going to end up with a weak b3 pawn long term. So they played c3. That's weak. And now the black rooks switch targets. Musical chairs. He played b6, and the reason for b6 is to prevent white from playing c5, which would activate their rook. This would have been much better. They missed their opportunity. Maybe it's equal. But after b6, the counterplay is just gone. And so he steadily creeped his way in with all the pieces. And here white blundered. With f4, they kind of hastened their demise. So let's see if you guys can guess the winning operation for black. Try to give a couple moves. It's all pretty forcing, I think. Let me just double check. Yeah, it's all forcing stuff. So black to play and get a winning position. h5 has to be the first move? Why? Why should it be? I think these absolute statements are very dangerous to your sanity as a chess player. There are going to be many times when you say, this has to be it. And then it doesn't have to be. I think as a coach, I tend to be more absolute than I should be, because I try to make things feel more clear and more confident for the people who are trying to solve the puzzle. I don't like to just give the puzzle and be like, okay, you figure it out. You know, I try to encourage people a bit. So if I ever seem a little bit dogmatic, it's because I'm trying to steer you guys in the right direction, get a little confidence boost. But in a real game, it's good to avoid this kind of dogmatic thinking. Rook g1 at some point does look interesting. f4 has a purpose, though. They want to get some open files and take them over with their rooks. Get some counterplay. If they could attack the weak c-pawn, they might just be able to win. So I think if you play very slowly, you might encounter difficulties. So let's look at the more forced lines first. Rook g1 is not that forcing. So I would look at h5, pawn takes f4. These are probably the two main forcing moves. The reason I'm not considering e4 is that they can just play like rook e3. The reason I'm not considering a move like rook g5 is it's hanging, and there's no benefit to putting a pawn on g5 for white. If they had a pawn on, like... Alright, so there was a possible mate, so it's sometimes worth considering these crazy things. If white played h4, h5 is mate, right? So whenever the king is kind of trapped, it's good to think about, you know, even the spicier moves, if they could lead to a trapping of the king. But after f4, the king is also able to come back. They want open lines. They also want to bring their king to f3. I'll give the first move. This is creating a weakness long-term on f4. That's usually a good way to start a combination, by saddling your opponent with long-term weaknesses. Now what? Rook f1? What if they play Rook f3 after Rook f1? Your rook's hanging after, like, King g3. So is it worth it to play h5 at this time? If you play h4, I'll play King g4. I'm not sure. Well, maybe this is too subtle. So let me point something out. It's not like complete lights out in one shot, but the idea is that this rook on b3 is busy. So he played h5 first, and then rook g1, and then rook g4 to make the rook do some work, right? So we take this. So we win the pawn. This position would still be unclear if it weren't for this operation that he's about to commence with. So king f5 is winning for black, of course, because their king is much better than the white king. But there's still possibility for counterplay. So the way he eliminates all counterplay from this position is with rook f3, rook b3. And now the pawn has to advance after some useless checks. Alright, they're not useless. It puts black's king in a more passive position for a short time. But after b5, the queen side is done. It's totally blocked. It's not going to come out again. Yeah, maybe I was optimistic. I thought that since the first few moves were check, that it was very plausible to find rook g4 and that they can't defend it. Usually when the first few moves are check, I think it's much easier to spot it. But anyway, coming forward again. So he wins the pawn, fixes the weakness, and then he comes back to advance the king side. And this position, you can just take this as a screenshot in your mind of a winning position for black. King's cut off from guarding this critical part of the board by the rook on f6. And this part has a lot of shiesty maneuvering. The check and then coming back steals a tempo because their king can't advance in any way. They tried c5 desperately, which makes some sense. But after d6, black is winning with a tactic. This is an easier tactic. See if you guys can spot it. Black to play. And I don't think tactic is a strong word because they're threatening to take on c7 and get a winning position in two different ways. So we need to do something sharp to prevent that. Yeah, rook d7. I think that this is probably all you need to see. Because after rook takes c7, you're forced to take on d6. Rook d4 is a nice move. Because it's kind of showing that he doesn't care that his king is stuck on the edge. It's controlling the important squares. This maneuvering part is a little bit difficult to explain. It's all tactical stuff. Actually, here's an interesting maneuvering part. So this is a big Yoshilo. No, I'm not playing anyone today. Well, I did all the playing earlier. I played a simul, but now I'm just wrapping up a lesson on maneuvering. So when the rook is checking your king from far away, it can be really annoying when they alternate attacking your king and attacking your king and a pawn. So this zigzag pattern is a good way of neutralizing that. You get closer without ever allowing your pawn to hang. This is a really nice pattern. So after rook c8, rook f3, and the exchange of a couple pawns, they just resigned. Janowski gave up here. Because the two connected pass pawns on the king side is such a big advantage that basically almost anyone can beat an engine here with black, in my opinion. I've tried beating a computer in Rook end games where we have just one pass pawn, and it's technically much, much more difficult. But in this situation, the connected pawns are really, really big. And the king's not even in front. So it makes sense that Janowski resigned against the great Rubinstein here. So this was kind of a maneuvering symphony, this last game. It showed a lot of the concepts that I thought we could derive from base principles, like how the pieces interact with the board, interact with each other, how the slower moving pawns, you can kind of consider them as like a long-term field of control and then maneuver around it accordingly. In this game, I think Rubinstein really nicely shows how we can bring all these together into a masterpiece game. So if you guys have any questions for me, I think now's a good time. Otherwise, I want to raid someone. I'm going to just poke around Twitch a bit. Yeah, you got it. Always a pleasure.